Welcome to the Visual Novel Verdict, a brand new visual novel focused review show for my channel. In each review, I'll focus on some technical aspects as well as the story and characters individually, trying to be as thorough as possible without talking all day or spoiling things from the game. At the end of the review, I'll post a number of what I consider to be the game's most polarizing points that may attract or detract people. The hope is that I'm thorough enough that a score isn't necessary while identifying common points of contention so that you can decide for yourself whether the game is worth your money or not without me slapping it with an arbitrary score. Today I'll be looking at Sunrider Liberation Day, so let's get to it. Sunrider Liberation Day is the latest title from the English visual novel studio, Love in Space, and technically the second main universe title in the Sunrider franchise. The first Sunrider game, ultimately subtitled Mask of Arcadius, was a rousing Kickstarter success, raising $44,039, with its initial goal a mere $3,000. There was clearly a good bit of interest for a game of its kind, part space visual novel and part tactical mecha RPG. The game made it onto the Steam distribution platform as well, exposing it to an even wider audience. And with the original game being completely free, it offered the lowest barrier to entry possible to get invested in the series. Afterwards, Love in Space ventured a side project called Sunrider Academy, a title that took place in an alternate universe where the mecha pilots and Captain Kaito Shields are instead Academy students, with the gameplay focus on managing several clubs rather than battling enemies. Now Love in Space is back with this new main universe title, Sunrider Liberation Day. But first, let's talk about what the Sunrider universe is on a basic level and the main characters that you'll see in Liberation Day. Oh, and as a quick aside, while I will try to avoid spoilers from the first game where I can, I will be talking about some of the most important cornerstones from Mask of Arcadius that shape the story of Liberation Day. Keep that in mind if you haven't played Mask of Arcadius yet. Sunrider Liberation Day picks up right where Sunrider Mask of Arcadius left off, so I wouldn't recommend playing this one unless you've played Mask of Arcadius first. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, you can download Sunrider Mask of Arcadius entirely free right off of Steam. Playing Mask of Arcadius should give you a decent idea if you're even going to have an interest in Liberation Day anyway. To sum things up quickly, you play as the captain of the starship Sunrider, Kaito Shields. The captain comes from the planet Sarah, an independent world that identifies itself as a member of the Neutral Rim, worlds that have not allied with either the Solar Alliance or Pact. The Solar Alliance is an economic and militaristic alliance of many like-minded worlds that exists present day as the galaxy's current greatest power. Pact, on the other hand, is an acronym for the People's Alliance for Common Treatment, and initially began as a mere resistance movement within the former corrupt superpower known as the New Empire. After overthrowing the New Empire, Pact set their sights on the Solar Alliance, with their leader, Viniscar Arcadius, condemning the Alliance for its inequality. While that may sound noble in theory, Captain Kaito Shields' homeworld of Sarah is ruthlessly attacked by Pact forces at the beginning of the original game, prompting the beginning of his spacefaring campaign against the Pact forces with the ultimate hope of liberating his homeworld. To be honest, I love the depth of history that these games allude to. Even just the events currently touched on and the factions you encounter throughout the game so far make the galaxy feel huge and rich in lore, and the idea that these insane weapons you encounter could exist seems possible, if a bit implausible. Of course, the captain of the Sunrider is nothing without his crew, and in that regard, Love in Space has you covered with numerous conveniently cute space waifus, most of whom can control a personal, powerful spacefaring mech known as Riders. First, we have the series poster girl, Asuga Okarun. Asuga is the typically overly cheerful, positive force of the group that isn't the brightest, but tries her best to keep on a brave face. Her limits are certainly tested in that regard in Sunrider Liberation Day though. Asuga refers to herself as a hero of justice, and while she can certainly be immature, she won't let a wrongdoing go unrecognized. In the first game, Kaito discovers that Asuga is also the Shar of Ruvia, the princess of an ancient empire that has now fallen into ruin with only its homeworld under its current control. Asuga has mixed feelings on her birthright though. She clearly feels more at home just being a rider pilot aboard the Sunrider with Kaito. She pilots the rider known as Blackjack. Next, there's Chigara Ashada. Chigara joins the Sunrider's crew at the same time as her friend, Asuka. Chigara is a rather shy girl who is nearly unmatched as an engineer. Her knowledge makes her an invaluable part of the crew, although Chigara herself really just wants to open a bakery on a simple, quiet world and do her own thing. However, the current state of the galaxy, as well as the relationships that she establishes on board the Sunrider, means that her dream isn't likely to come true anytime soon. At the end of Mask of Arcadius, we discover that Chigara shares a disturbing link with Arcadius and others like him. It is that link that formulates much of Liberation Day's story. To avoid spoilers, I'm clearly being vague. Chigara pilots the rider Liberty in battle. Moving on, we have Ava Crescentia. Ava has a unique relationship with Kaito as she grew up as his childhood friend, and it seems that the two have had a romance of some degree in the past as well. Ava serves as Kaito's first officer on board the Sunrider, and while she is cold and strict to a fault at times, it is her uncompromising pragmatism that Kaito relies upon when he knows something needs to be done. While the two often butt heads when interacting on anything but a professional level, and their relationship is clearly somewhat awkward, they also share a deep trust rooted in their long history. Ava does not pilot a rider, but instead supports Kaito as he relays his orders on board the Sunrider in combat. Next, we have Claude Triello. Serving as the medical officer on board the Sunrider, Claude seems surprisingly airheaded. She flirts with Kaito at pretty much any opportunity that presents itself, and she has the, curves to make those advances quite alluring indeed. Or is that just me? Anyway, Claude is quite a shameless woman, and as discovered in Mask of Arcadius, her medical credentials are also entirely a fraud. So just who is she, really? That remains quite a mystery, but Liberation Day shines quite a bit of insight on the good doctor. What I can say here is that Claude is quite an effective support rider pilot when controlling her rider, Bianca. The space waifus just keep rolling with Krista stars. Or is it stairs? Anyway, Krista is actually an officer assigned to the Sunrider from the Solar Alliance forces. Ostensibly a liaison between Sarah's neutral warship, the Sunrider, and the Alliance, it comes as no surprise that Krista met with a great deal of suspicion and mistrust after joining the crew back in Mask of Arcadius. However, she's proven herself to the crew and her allies through numerous vicious battles inside her rider, the Paladin. Sadly, Krista doesn't even get a route in the DLC, so any Krista fans are no doubt rather disappointed by the lack of focus on her in Liberation Day. Next, we have Ikari Isidolde. Before joining up with Kaito and crew back in Mask of Arcadius, Ikari was a mercenary, often dealing with the scum of the galaxy to make her living by fighting others' battles in her rider. She's now been aboard the Sunrider for quite some time, and Kaito and the others have grown to understand that the girl is the type to be very dishonest with her feelings on the surface. So she's your tsundere character. Ikari is extremely skilled in her rider, the Phoenix, in melee combat with its katana. Finally, we have Sola v Ruvia. Sola, like Asuka, is a Char of Ruvia. However, the two aren't sisters. It's discovered in Mask of Arcadius that Sola has traveled through time somehow from a millennia past in the ancient empire of Ruvia to the present. The details of her arrival still aren't fully understood, but as an excellent sniper when in control of her rider, the Seraphim, she quickly became a welcome addition to the Sunrider's crew. Sola is quiet and often seems detached from the things going on around her, but it would be a mistake to take her silence for apathy. Infrequently, Sola has expressed her concerns to Kaito and her crewmates, though Sola is certainly not outgoing and therefore seems to have few attachments on the ship aside from Kaito and Asuka, whom Sola seeks out to offer her loyalty to as the current era's true Char. Why, yes, she is my favorite character. The plot of Liberation Day picks up following the prior mentioned revelation about Arcadius' identity and its link to Chigara, and that connection gives way to breeding mistrust among the Sunrider's crew while moving forward to try and eventually liberate Kaito's homeworld of Serra. Along the way, there are various twists and turns through a campaign that is interesting but lacks some of the original's charm in many ways, but we'll get to that. Sunrider Liberation Day's art in general is a step up from Mask of Arcadius, though you should expect some reused assets. If I had to lobby a particular complaint, it would be that the characters are too clean, but this sort of thing is obviously a matter of personal taste to a degree. The backgrounds displayed in the visual novel sections often look fantastic, and the characters are almost always really emotive in presentation, sometimes a little overly emotive, if anything. Anyway, artistically, so long as you don't have a problem with the anime-inspired art style, you're likely to enjoy what Sunrider Liberation Day has on offer. The sound design is another matter, however. There's some really odd quirks here. The music in general is appropriate for the anime-inspired space opera that Sunrider is, but it often loops quite awkwardly. An example is the in-game song Posthumus Regrum, a foreboding battle theme that ends with a bit of vocal fanfare that sounds quite at odds with the tone of the rest of the track. As soon as it loops, the tone that the music has been setting is just jarringly reset. Some have also expressed their dissatisfaction with the fact that Mask of Arcadius used English voiceovers for the battle sequences while being unvoiced in the visual novel sections. But Liberation Day, on the other hand, opts to hire Japanese voice actors for the visual novel and battle sequences. It is worth noting that you can now choose to use the Old English voices from Mask of Arcadius in battle if you prefer that though. Personally, I didn't have a problem with the shift myself, but I will say that the audio balance just seems off. At the default settings, some musical tracks completely drown out the voices, and the voices themselves sometimes just sound muffled. It's strange, but you'll understand what I mean if you play it for yourself. I don't have a problem with either the English or Japanese voices for Sunrider myself, but I don't really mind playing the Sunrider games with no voices at all either, so I'm definitely in the minority here. Overall, I do think that the audio direction of the series needs some work though. The options available in Sunrider are pretty typical for a visual novel, allowing full screen and windowed modes, for you to skip through any previously read dialogue automatically, the text speed as well as the auto advance speed if auto mode is selected, and the audio balance for music, sound effects, and the voices. The more unique options include the aforementioned ability to use the English voices from Mask of Arcadius in place of the Japanese ones, if you prefer. The difficulty of the turn-based strategy mecha battles going from the extremely easy waifu mode to the insanely difficult space whale mode, and the ability to turn on or off tooltips and mouse edge scrolling for the battles. Pretty atypical. When you start a new game, you'll be prompted with another surprising option: the ability to import a saved game from Mask of Arcadius to transfer your decisions forward into this game, or else a menu to select from a variety of choices from numerous important points in Mask of Arcadius. After choosing these and shaping a bit of how your Kaito shields either did or would have behaved in the previous game, you're thrust right into battle with very little setup. If you played Mask of Arcadius, you'll understand what's going on, but if you haven't or haven't played it in a long time, like me, you'll be left scratching your head a bit. You'll pick it up though, so don't worry. Now, let's talk about combat in Sunrider Liberation Day. In a word, battles are clunky. When you engage in combat, you'll set up your squad's formation on the left side of the hex grid, while the enemy appears on the right. However, as you start clicking on your units to get things started, it quickly becomes clear that the Ren'Py engine was not designed to handle this sort of system. Oftentimes, clicking on a hex with your units or enemy units won't select them, or the battles will hitch up with lag as you or your enemies move. This also happens sometimes when you just click on a unit. It becomes absolutely infuriating if you played strategy games with a smooth, responsive engine. It's a shame because the actual design of the battles can be fun. You and your enemy riders both have armor and shields which help defend against various types of attacks. Battle is about wearing down and circumventing these means of defense to wear down your enemy's HP and ultimately destroy them, while of course defending your own squad. You have to take into account distance as well as various types of attacks, and it all comes together for a good strategy experience. But, at least for me, the engine completely ruined it. The battle UI is also quite subpar, not giving you the information that you typically want at a glance. And I already discussed how annoying the simple act of clicking on something can be to get the information that you need. Ultimately, I just turned the difficulty down to waifu mode in irritation so that I could get on with things. That's never a good sign. Granted, if you have the patience of a saint, you might find combat fun and rewarding due to the strategic depth of its mech battles. You just have to put up with a lot of frustrating quirks in order to do that. So, how about the visual novel portions? How is it? Like the combat, I feel very mixed on that point. The writing in Sunrider has always given glimpses of an interesting history and galaxy, but in my opinion, the individual character interactions are often kind of shallow and feel rushed. Not shuffle rushed, mind you, but still rushed. I feel like Love in Space needs to give some of these scenes room to breathe, but perhaps they're happy with this atypically fast pace for a visual novel. In addition, the game really leans into its melodrama. If you can forgive those things, you'll probably find the writing in Liberation Day to be interesting, if surprisingly linear. In the main campaign of Liberation Day, you get the sense that your choices mean almost nothing. Without spoiling anything, you're railroaded down a romance path with one of the game's characters, and even if you utterly disagree with the main character's course of action on events, you won't be able to offer any direction to change it. This resulted in a lot of people who picked up the game after release feeling severely disappointed, and I can see why. Mask of Arcadius felt like it was a build-up to a game that would let you choose a space waifu for Kaito and overthrow the Vile Pact after all. The scenario doesn't quite follow that assumption, and there will clearly be more Sunrider games to come. What I found to be extremely interesting, and one of the main reasons that this review is actually happening to begin with, is that after seeing this reaction, Love in Space didn't dismiss or even deflect these complaints, but rather responded to them in an extremely direct way by releasing the free Return DLC for the game, a sub-campaign that's available now that lets you play through a portion of the game's main scenario as an alternative version of the main character, who's armed with information about coming events and is given an opportunity to change the course of the future. Along the way, you're able to team up with a heroine of your choice and given a tangible feeling that your choices are directly influencing the situation. This is exactly what people wanted. There are dead-end paths from making failed decisions in combat, bad endings that result in a future as bleak or even more bleak than the future that you came from, and good endings that give you a feeling that Kaito narrowly saved the day. While it could be said to be a bit formulaic, it directly addressed complaints about the main scenario and gives players a satisfying alternate resolution to the game's events. Sadly, it is just a side scenario, but it goes a very long way to making the game feel like a game that's worth the price as a visual novel, rather than as a horribly optimized strategy game. The DLC, as well as the extended ending that was added to address complaints of a cliffhanger ending, lack voices, but the events in both are interesting, and frankly, give more characterization to Kaito's shields and several of the other heroines than you get throughout the entire main game. That could be viewed as good or bad, but I choose to think of it as a fantastic response to customer feedback. I hope Love in Space uses that feedback to help craft Sunrider going forward. Now, one can only hope that they'll move forward from the Ren'Py engine to another engine more optimized for their combat, and retool the combat UI. If they can take lessons learned and make tweaks like that, I see an extremely bright future for this franchise. Even as is, I'm looking forward to seeing where the story goes from here, as crazy as the story can be. In the end, Sunrider Liberation Day is a strange case. To be blunt, I don't like the main scenario very much. While intriguing at the time, the lack of freedom and lackluster combat can make it a frustrating experience as often as an exciting one. If you temper your expectations going in and treat it like a kinetic novel, you're likely to enjoy it more. But it just doesn't excel at any one thing enough for me to really recommend it to people besides those already invested in Sunrider as a series. With the free DLC added though, my impressions of the package changed to a fairly positive one. Instead of just piling questions on top of questions, players are provided some answers, and given the feeling that player choice again matters. Characters are more fleshed out, and the main character redeems himself as being somewhat credible instead of a lumbering fool. It's also got some fun for completionists, as there are quite a few endings of good and bad varieties if you want to unlock everything. or just follow a walkthrough if exploring choices isn't your thing. But perhaps as important to me personally as the fact that the DLC is actually quite good is that it was a direct and humble response to player feedback based on the campaign's failings as voiced by the majority. For a company to admit they screwed up and try to make things right these days in a public and extremely hasty fashion is a rare thing indeed, and one that should be commended. Hell, the company's response is honestly a large part of the reason that I bought the game. Of course, that isn't to say that you should buy Liberation Day just for that reason. There are any number of reasons that Liberation Day may not strike a chord with players. But if you're intrigued by what you've seen here, supporting a forthright company that tries to do right by its fans is just the icing on the cake. Here's the overview. I said it before, but the art in Liberation Day is colorful and clean. The environments look great, and the characters are attractive. If you're a fan of the art style, this is certainly a plus for the game. It probably goes without saying, but if you're excited by the idea of essentially role-playing the captain of a starship on a quest to liberate his homeworld with a variety of beauties wearing plug suits that pilot giant mecha, well then I'd be surprised if you didn't know about Sunrider before now. The setting is honestly one of the biggest recommendation points for this game, as it leans into the sci-fi genre and the galactic setting unabashedly. If you're a fan of visual novel hybrids, particularly ones with turn-based combat, then Sunrider Liberation Day is a game to look into. The combat may be held back by interface and performance issues, but at least the performance issues are just a matter of the engine rather than design. If you're patient, then you can find some meat on these strategy bones, especially on higher difficulties. While Sunrider Liberation Day has the occasional casual conversation or slice of life moment, for the most part, it leads in from one high-charge conflict to the next, be it in combat or in the VN-style scenes. If you're the sort of player that finds most visual novels to be a bit too long-winded, you may find Liberation Day to be a breath of fresh air. Also, the game has quite a few crazy twists, which might intrigue you. This is a no-brainer, really, but if you played and enjoyed the free first game of the series, then you're naturally going to be more invested in seeing how the story shakes out. Plus, if you have an interest in Liberation Day and haven't played Sunrider and are still on the fence, then you can always give Mask of Arcadius a shot for free and make the choice from there. You'll get more out of Liberation Day by playing the first game prior anyway. Whether it's a matter of the somewhat awkwardly looping music or the occasional odd delivery or muffled line, the sound work in the game just needs some work. If you're sensitive about this sort of thing, consider it a mark against Liberation Day. I know I've harped on this point endlessly now, but the main scenario is going to annoy the hell out of you if you're expecting to be able to live happily ever after with the space waifu of your choice. Go in expecting that, and know that the DLC has your back if this is what you're wanting. But at least for the main game, expect a fairly static scenario with some intriguing and some insane plot twists. Of course, if you don't like the flow of the story being broken up by combat, then you're going to get frustrated with the battles in Sunrider Liberation Day. The battles are constant, and to be honest, I felt like they were a bit overdone. I would have preferred a bigger focus on the visual novel aspects of the game, with combat being reserved only for the nail-biting scenarios. I would have felt differently if combat were a smoother experience, but it is what it is. I know this is a pet peeve for some people, so let's get one thing straight. Sunrider Liberation Day is not the end of the Sunrider story, and the end of the game is certainly not conclusive. The ending at release was a shameless cliffhanger that has since been patched to be considerably lesser so, but it still leaves you with more questions about what comes next than answers. Again, the DLC is much more satisfying in this regard as you're playing a smaller sub-scenario that wraps up quite cleanly by the end, one way or another. Just keep it in mind if this is the sort of thing that bothers you. And that's it. That concludes the first episode of the visual novel Verdict. Being candid, I overall do like Liberation Day and I don't regret buying it, although that's largely thanks to the return DLC. If you played it, what did you think? Let me know in the comments. Also, I don't ordinarily do this, but if you enjoyed the review, then please do leave a like. This is the start of a potential new series for the channel, and these reviews do take a lot of time, so I'm very grateful for any support. Either way, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Welcome to the Visual Novel Verdict, a brand new visual wobble review show. So many wobbles, so little time. The options available in Sunrider are pretty typical for a visual novel, allowing for full screen mode. Her knowledge makes her an invaluable part of the crew, although Chigara herself really just wants to open a fucking bakery. Goddamn bakery, Chigara. Why you gotta go on and on about your freaking bakery? You're like, I want to open a bakery. Let's open a bakery together. I don't want to open a bakery. I want to save the universe with giant freaking space robots.